Just a quick word about us. We are Maine Lakes Society. We are a statewide lake conservation organization. Hopefully you've all heard of LakeSmart. It's our flagship program. We work on lake association support programs, see how we can help our amazing local lake associations thrive. We have Lakes Alive, which is an outdoor education program. We're doing a lot of planning with that program this summer. It's on hiatus in terms of getting out in person with kids. But we're doing a lot of planning and hopefully coming back with some really great revisions to Lakes Alive next year. And then we're also in Augusta and DC working on lake advocacy and clean water issues. So today, thanks again for joining us. We have Brooke Hafford MacDonald, who will be talking about loon mortality and human attitudes. Brooke has an MS in ecology and environmental sciences from the University of Maine, where she studied lead poisoning and Maine's common loons and attitudes about lead tackle, which is what she's going to talk to you about today. She has worked as a ranger in Acadia National Park and as a field biologist with Biodiversity Research Institute. Brooke also started with Maine Lakes in December as a LakeSmart program manager. She has brought to Maine Lakes a deep knowledge of social science and an understanding of the many factors that motivate or limit behavior change. Her energy and enthusiasm for working with people and volunteers, along with her background in ecology and conservation, make her an incredibly valuable asset for the LakeSmart program and a great new addition to the Maine Lakes staff. So, welcome, Brooke, and thanks so much for giving this presentation. I hand it over to you. I will turn off my screen.
Thank you very much for that lovely introduction. I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen here. All right, can you see that?
Yeah.
Susan? Okay, perfect. So yes, my name is Brooke, and I'm going to talk to you today about common loon mortality and human attitudes. As Susan said, I'm the new LakeSmart program manager for the Maine Lakes Society. I became interested in common loons when I was about 19 years old, trying to share my slide, and it's not working, so excuse me, I'm going to get out of this. Sorry, I had this problem a little bit earlier, so we're going to see if we can fix it.
So we could see your slides. Is that what you were referring to?
I couldn't move my slide.
Oh, we have had that problem.
Yeah, we have had that problem, and unfortunately, oops. Oh. There we go. I think I got it this time. So yeah, I became interested in common loon studies when I was 19. I was an intern with the Biodiversity Research Institute studying loons in the field while I was an undergraduate at the College of the Atlantic. A couple of years ago, I worked as a park ranger in Acadia. I had a loon program every single week at an amphitheater. It was a lot of fun. And now I'm working with Maine Lakes, and we're doing LakeSmart, but also LoonSmart. And I'm also still contracted with the Inland Fisheries and Wildlife here in Maine as a necropsy specialist for loon studies. And I've been working in the necropsy lab with them and also with the Biodiversity Research Institute for the past few years. I think I did my first necropsy in 2015, so I've been doing that a little while too. So let's first start with some very basic information about loons. The loon you see here is in its beautiful breeding plumage. Loons nest on freshwater lakes and ponds in the northernmost part of the United States and Canada. And we know from previous studies that lead poisoning has been documented to be the leading known cause of death in loons in the Northeast, and also in Maine in particular. Loons are primarily piscivores, meaning that they love to eat fish. And if you've ever seen a loon fishing, they will swallow a fish whole. And they also eat other things too, like crustaceans, crayfish, and crabs when they're in the ocean, but they love to eat fish. They also swallow stones from the bottom of the lake. They'll pick little stones up in their mouths and swallow them and hold them in what we call a gizzard. It's like the loon equivalent of a stomach, and we call those stones gizzard stones. And we think it helps them grind up food because they're eating all of these bony fish very bony fish whole. And that's important to know because this is how they become exposed to lead. So there's two methods of exposure. The first is if they pick up a sinker or a jig from the lake bed, mistaking it for a gizzard stone. A lot of stones are, a lot of lead tackle that we use in the freshwater environment is similarly sized and shaped like a gizzard stone. So sometimes loons will pick them up, swallow them purposefully, and then become poisoned in that manner. But loons, as you can see, actually I should say that picture on the top is the gizzard is opened and you can see the stones, and there's a little arrow pointing to the piece of lead tackle inside. So you can see the size comparison there and the shape comparison. The second method of exposure is consumption of fish with attached fishing gear. So if you're an angler like I am, sometimes you want to release a fish back into the environment after you catch it. And if the jig is really far down into the throat of the fish, it's really tempting to just snip the line and then let the fish go back into the water. But what that does is it impairs the fish, possibly making them easier to catch. And then a loon may come along or another animal and swallow that fish. So you can see the fish that the loon has here is really large. This is the kind of sized fish that anglers really like to go after. So that's another method of exposure to lead fishing tackle as well. Once lead is ingested by a loon or any animal, the effects of this are really widespread throughout the body system. You can probably tell just by looking at the photo of this loon that it's not well. This is actually a photo taken from Maine, and this loon landed in a parking lot. Perhaps it thought it was a lake, but it doesn't look well, does it? And whenever you find a loon that has lead poisoning, it's pretty apparent that they're in a lot of distress. They can be disoriented, like this loon maybe was. They breathe really heavy and open mouth breathing. They become weak, potentially paralyzed, difficulties holding down food. Polydipsia and polyuria are excessive thirst and urination. They may have seizures, go blind, make unusual vocalizations. And then a characteristic sign of lead poisoning in birds is called wing droop. You see it in eagles as well. This loon here, you can see the wings are kind of flopped on the sides. They're touching the pavement. And normally those wings would be tucked in really nice and tight against the body. So this loon actually did have lead poisoning and later passed. But if the loon does live to see another day, if it survives the initial exposure, that doesn't mean it's over. Lead, unfortunately, can impact all of the body systems and lead to a lot of problems long term. So Dr. Mark Pokris, who you see here on the left, he has been necropsying loons since the 1980s in the Northeast primarily, but all over the country and in Canada. And he has a very long, extensive data set with meticulous records, which is great. And Susan Gallo, our own Susan Gallo, who you see here on the right, back when she was with Maine Audubon, they got together around 2012, looked at his data very carefully, and extracted the cases that were just in Maine. And they reported that lead poisoning was the leading cause of death in Maine loons, in adult Maine loons. And that report was released by Maine Audubon in 2013. And that's really important because it really was something that led to stricter regulations in our legislation. So let's talk about the legislation just a little bit. At the top here you see in 2002, they banned the sale of lead sinkers weighing ½ ounce or less. 2013, they banned the sale and use of lead sinkers, and there was a different restriction. 2016, banned the sale of bare lead jigs of a certain size. 2017, banned the use of bare lead jigs of a certain size. So LD 730 was passed in 2013, but it was rolled out in different phases. So it moved from sale and use from sinkers to jigs, and it got a little stricter as it went forward. But I'm going to also just note too that in the 2016 and 17 legislation, there's a word bare, meaning that the legislation allows for a layer of paint to cover lead tackle, and that's still acceptable within the rules. So how well paint will protect an animal from lead poisoning is not yet determined. But anyway, so there are different restrictions that have progressed through the years. And just if you're wondering what a sinker looks like versus a jig is basically a sinker with a hook attached. And then the jigs that you see here are painted. So if you still see these in stores, it's because they have the paint that they're allowed to be sold. So immediately after that legislation was passed, there was an initiative developed called Fish Lead Free. And it consisted of these 5 stakeholder groups: Maine Audubon, Bass Nation, Maine Lakes Society, Sportsmen's Alliance of Maine, and the Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife. So right in 2003, they hit the ground running and got a lot of the materials out to anglers about, this is new legislation, this is something you need to think about. They put a lot of education materials out, and it was really very effective. But since human behavior is the root cause of lead in freshwater environments from fishing tackle, understanding behaviors can facilitate more targeted initiatives. In other words, just because it's illegal doesn't mean people won't want to do it, and they might not stop doing it, or because they were told not to. So I have this quote at the bottom: if we just educate them, they will change their behavior. One of the things that I early on, before I really got into the social science piece, was, well, if people knew that it was killing loons, then they would stop. And I realized pretty soon that that was a naive way of thinking, but I'm going to talk more about that in just a little bit. So my study objectives, we had 2 overarching goals. One was to measure lead mortality rates in Maine's common loons. We were building on the 2012 report. Like I said, I got into the lab in 2015, but I was able to have access to the data that was collected in 2013 and 14. And then the second was explore Maine resident perceptions regarding lead tackle toxicity. So 2 very different methodologies, and I loved this project a lot. It was really fun. The first component, lead mortality in common loons. So this is the necropsy piece. My hypothesis was that lead poisoning would be the leading known cause of death of common loons in Maine until 2016, which is when we had the data. I will stop here and say that we do have, I was involved in necropsying loons from 2017, and there were loons necropsied from 2018. We're currently working on 2019, and of course we'll have loons coming in soon for 2020. So we are building on this study. It takes a small village to perform a single necropsy. First, somebody has to find the loon in the wild, and then they have to report it, and then someone has to go get it, and then it has to be brought to our lab. So there's a lot of steps that need to go, that need to take place before we can actually do the necropsy. But once it's in our lab, the first thing we do is get it x-rayed. And you can see here on the loon x-ray, there's a metallic object, and it just glows on the x-ray. It's really a great way to tell if there's a metallic object inside the bird. And then you kind of know what to look for too when you're opening it up. And of course, every animal that we necropsy gets cataloged, photographed, and then we do our external examination. Are there any fractures, broken bones, obvious signs of trauma, any injuries that are kind of obvious from the outside? And then of course we open it up and look inside. We also take a lot of samples for mercury analysis, cyanobacteria, malaria. We take a lot of samples. We're not just looking at lead, we're trying to look at overall cause of death in general. So here's another loon stomach or gizzard that's opened up. This was a photo we took. You can see all of these little stones inside. And there's the lead sinker right there. So it's hard to tell. Imagine being a loon. It's hard to tell what's a stone and what isn't. But then we have to determine if this is actually a lead object or not. It could be made of brass or some other metal. So in order to determine that, we have lead care or lead check swabs. And you can see in the photo here, you just kind of rub it on the piece of tackle, and if it shows up bright pink, then you know that you're dealing with a lead object. We also take body fluid samples. So it's not whole blood. After a loon dies or anything dies, the blood changes consistency. It mixes in with respiratory fluids and lymph and other things. But we are able to take a sample of that. You can see this in that little tube. And then we use a lead care analyzer, and we can see if the fluid levels are high. And we have a way of determining whether or not it's high, and if we could say safely that that loon did have lead poisoning. So I'm skipping the methods of how we analyzed everything and skipping the stats, but the big takeaway here is that common loon lead mortalities are looking like they're going to go down. They're starting to go down. You can see there's some variation in the bars. It's a little bit wavy, but the overall trend, and we found this was statistically significant, is that it is decreasing over time up to 2016. But of course, if something's decreasing, we knew it was the overall leading cause of death. If something like that is decreasing, then something else must be increasing, right? So this chart shows you the lead. These are the top 3 causes of death that we found in our necropsy lab. Lead is in green, so you can see it's starting to trend down. Fungal respiratory disease is in red, and you can see it's kind of up and down, up and down, up and down, but blue is trauma, and that has actually been increasing. And trauma in this case is blunt force trauma. There are different kinds of categories for trauma that we use, including territorial disputes between 2 loons. They fight to the death, and you can actually see some punctures in the sternum that indicate loon trauma. But the injuries that I'm talking about here are indicative of blunt force trauma, probably from a boat strike. So the conclusions here, lead was the leading cause of death overall, but it's starting to decrease. I'm going to say that with that legislation that we talked about, the last piece was in 2017. That's not very long. We only had a couple years here. So that's why it's so important to continue this study long-term. Long-term data sets are just so valuable, and it's something we need to keep an eye on. It's certainly not saying that, well, it's going down, we're good, the legislation's working. We really need some more time to look at this carefully. But trauma, blunt force trauma, is increasing. It first surpassed lead in 2009, but it was the leading cause of death in 2011 through 2013. So I'm really curious to get in there and get our new results from the last few years and see if this trend has continued. Okay, so the second piece of the work that we did was we surveyed Maine residents and talked to them or asked them about their attitudes about lead fishing tackle and common loon conservation. We randomly sampled 2,500 Maine residents. Every academic survey that goes out there is built on a previous model, and in our case we used a risk perceptions model. This is something that has been used in the literature many times for risk studies, and so we constructed our survey based on this. We did a mail invitation for an online survey. We got a 13% response rate, which wasn't too bad considering what we used, how we engaged people. And we used a 7-point Likert scale. So something I get asked a lot is, how do you measure an attitude? You know, it's not like measuring a weight on a scale or volume in a beaker. And a 7-point Likert scale is really how we do this. It's assigning a numeric value to a response to a question. So let's ask a question that's just yes or no or I don't know. So I'm going to ask Drew to put up a question for you. So hopefully everyone sees this. Do you believe that lead tackle covered in a layer of paint will protect loons from lead poisoning? So if you want to answer it, this is less about the content and more about the exercise, like a survey exercise. So don't worry about whether or not you're right or wrong, and no one's going to see your name attached to your answer. But let's take a few seconds to answer this question, and then we're going to look at the results. So hopefully everyone sees this. This doesn't surprise me. We had 3% say yes, and 81% said no, and then 17% said I don't know. So the 17% doesn't surprise me. I'm sure there are many of you out there who had never even considered this as an issue until about 5 minutes ago. So that doesn't surprise me at all. But there's a big difference between saying enthusiastically no, 100%, absolutely not, no way, versus saying, well, maybe not, I guess, I'm not really sure. So that's where the Likert scale comes in. We can measure what I call attitude strength. So let's put that back, let's put that same question framed a little bit differently on a Likert scale, if Drew would do that. Thank you, Drew. If you would please answer it. So now it's a statement or an item, not a question. And you can choose strongly disagree, disagree, somewhat disagree, neutral, somewhat agree, agree, or strongly agree. I believe that lead tackle covered in a layer of paint will protect loons from lead poisoning. So take a few seconds to answer that, please. Okay, so now we're seeing that the folks who said that they thought it would protect are kind of at a somewhat agree. Maybe they're not sure. Then we have somewhat disagree. Disagree was the most common, but then we have strongly disagree at 38%. And the reason why social scientists love the Likert scale, not only can you assign a numeric value and do stats and things, but it also shows you the strength of the attitude. So if somebody strongly disagrees with a statement or strongly agrees, their attitude is probably going to be a little bit harder to change. So I think a lot of you have probably taken surveys like this before, but I just thought it would be fun to share a little bit of the reasoning behind it. Thank you, Drew. So back to the risk perceptions model. You can see here in the circle are risk perceptions, and risk perceptions are how we feel about a risk. Is the risk high? Do we think it's a low risk? And this has nothing to do with actual risk. It's just how we perceive the risk, how high or dangerous we think something is, not actual risk. And then around the circle, you can see these 5 values, we call them constructs, that influence perceptions of risk. So understanding these constructs help us understand how people feel, therefore behaving a certain way. So if you're a stats person, the squares around the circle are the independent variables and the risk perceptions are the dependent variables. So that's kind of what we look at. And I'm going to go through that piece by piece so you can understand why we look at those things. But before I do, perception matters. Everybody, you can have a group of people staring at the same thing and they perceive it very differently. So sociodemographics, everybody who's taken a survey has had questions about their gender, race, how old they are, political affiliation, things like that. Those are all very common questions on every survey. And in risk studies, we know that gender plays a big role in risk perceptions. Across the board, we see that women have higher risk perceptions than men. That's very common throughout a lot of different risk studies. In cognitive issues, oh, I should say too that the risk here that we're measuring is lead tackle toxicity on loons. Just wanted to make that clear. So cognitive factors are probably one of the more complex constructs out there. How much people know about an issue. But of course, how much do they think they know about an issue? Those could also be two very different things. My actual knowledge versus my perceived level of knowledge. Maybe I have an inflated sense of self and think I know more than I actually do. So it's nice in surveys to ask people how much they think they know, and then kind of test their knowledge and see if those match. And like I said earlier, well, if we just educate people, they'll change their behavior. That's not always the case, of course. So presenting somebody with scientific facts, and they have access to the knowledge, if you will, doesn't necessarily mean that they will believe it. And then even if they believe it, it doesn't necessarily mean that they care enough to change their behavior. So knowledge is kind of a funny one, but we measure it anyway, and it's something that we did have in this survey here. Trust. When people don't understand the complexity of an issue around a risk, they seek the expert's opinion and people that they find trustworthy. So an easy example is if I'm in the lab and I see something in a loon that I don't understand, I will call Mark Bokrist, because he is somebody that I really value and trust and believe because of his experience and many other things. So we all have people in our lives that we trust and those we don't. Think about your favorite doctor, physician, mechanic, politician, and then think about two people that are giving the same message, the same exact message, and one you trust and one you don't. You're probably going to feel a lot differently in your belief when the person you trust is delivering the message. So when we think about the Fish Lead Free campaign and we saw all those groups that were involved, we had sportsmen's groups, we had the state government, we had conservation groups. It was really great that that initiative captured such a wide variety of groups, because sometimes people might not trust the state agency or trust a sportsman group or a conservation group. But that was really a nice representation of different groups. So that's why we measure trust. Is the messenger trustworthy? Sometimes it's less about the message and more about the messenger. Norms. The norms are conduct accepted by your family, your friends, and your peers. Social norms, we all want to belong. Do my friends fish with lead tackle? So if I go on a fishing trip with a group of friends and I'm the only one who's not using lead, I'm the only one not using lead free, I'm gonna feel kind of weird and I want to fit in. So maybe I'll make the switch because that's what all my friends are doing. So actually norms are really influential, and that's why we looked at it for this study. But it can be anything. You can all think of examples, I'm sure, of, well, maybe I started recycling because my friends encouraged me to do it, or I went to this restaurant because my friends encouraged me to do it. We see this all throughout our life on a daily basis. Experiences. So we know from other studies that direct personal experiences can impact attitudes and perhaps increase perceptions of risk. Have I witnessed or experienced a loon or other animal with lead poisoning? As I said earlier, if you see an animal that's in distress, it's actually pretty disturbing. And so that can really be impactful on a person's attitude. And a very famous example is from George Smith. He was from the Sportsmen's Alliance of Maine, and he wrote a really powerful column about how he had initially been against regulations for fishing tackle, but then one day he was outside and a woman came up to him and said, I found a loon, the loon is ill, I need help. And then they worked together to bring the loon to Avian Haven. It was later determined that it died of lead poisoning. And George wrote about how that impacted him and how he looked into the eyes of the loon and felt responsible. And this really did shape his attitude. I don't know him personally, but I would guess that this was a single experience really changed his attitude. And because seeing an animal in distress from lead is really profound. We asked these questions in our survey, but we didn't have a very high response rate. I don't expect for a lot of people to have had this experience, but direct experiences are really important with how we perceive a risk. Another example might be if I have had a tick-borne illness, my outdoor behavior might be very different from somebody else who has not. If I've had a flood in my house, I might have flood insurance, whereas somebody else might not. So direct experiences are very important too. And I'm going to spend just a couple more minutes talking about the values, which are like a social norm, if you will, excuse me, a personal norm. So we talked about social norms, but values are kind of like, what do I do when no one else is watching? These are really close to our being. They help guide us through life. And we know from other research that 3 broad value orientations help us understand perceptions of risk. So egoistic values, valuing myself. Socio-altruistic, valuing other people. And then biospheric values are valuing the environment. So those can really help us determine the level of risk perception that someone has. And values, you can see here at the top of the pyramid. Again, I said they were really close to us. They develop really young, when we're really young. They remain stable throughout one's lifetime, and they're very, very difficult to change. So this is really important when I talk a little bit about some of our results. As you move down the pyramid, you can see we go down to beliefs, attitudes, behavioral intentions, and then behaviors. Once you get to the bottom of the pyramid, behaviors are really, we have lots of them. They're easily changed. They're very context specific. I'm sure all of you have experienced, you have an intention to finish a report today, or go to the gym after work, or do something, but then something comes up and you don't get to it. So behaviors are much less stable than values unless the behavior is connected to the value. So yes, they act as background factors that influence behaviors. Do you have high biospheric values? And there are ways that we test for that in our survey. So one hypothesis, we had a lot. I'm only going to talk about one just in the interest of time. But respondents who have high biospheric values will have higher risk perceptions. And again, I'm skipping all of the methods and the stats and just going right to the conclusions, but I'd be happy to talk to you more about that. So yes, not surprisingly at all, biospheric values positively influenced risk perceptions. In other words, people who care about the environment are more concerned about lead poisoning. I'm sure you're all shocked to hear this, and you're probably wondering, well, why is that information valuable? Right? So what? So I think of values as you're reaching certain audiences with certain messages, but you're not reaching everyone potentially. So since value systems are nearly impossible to change, we said that earlier, right? Rather than attempting to change environmental values, another strategy is to communicate differently. So if your goal is to move someone from egoistic value center to a biospheric value center and they're an adult, you're probably got a long road ahead. So another thing you can do, which is probably easier, is reframe your message to appeal to different value systems. So for example, with lead, addressing human health concerns, and in addition to, I should say, we don't want to leave the loons out of it, of course, but in addition to common loon and wildlife health, might appeal to people who are more guided by altruistic or egoistic values. So my personal health or the health of my family, we know that lead is toxic. We've known for hundreds of years that lead is toxic. So talking about human health and lead might be able to rope in a different audience, potentially. And from our survey, just to illustrate this a little bit, the #1 reason anglers have made the switch to lead-free tackle is common loon health. So you can see on the column on the far left, we asked them why I have switched to lead-free tackle. Very important. The top reasons were common loons and wildlife health. But we also asked them, if you still use lead, why might you switch? And if you look at that column again on the left, those columns on the left, the question is why I might switch to lead-free tackle. It's very slight, but people were more willing to switch for my personal health or the health of my family. So a human message might appeal to those people more than a common loon or wildlife message. So a few quick takeaways. Continue to please fish lead-free and encourage your friends to do the same. Some of your friends might respond really well to facts and figures and numbers, and others might like to learn by watching you. So if you're the person who always uses lead-free tackle, if you give it to your friends, if you talk about those things, that might be establishing a social norm, in which we determined was pretty important, and that could be a way to reach people. We need to recognize that boat strikes are an emerging conservation issue. A lot of people who took our survey, even though we didn't ask about boat strikes specifically, did comment that it was something they were concerned about and something that they were seeing on their lakes. So we need to recognize that in our research as well. And incorporate a wide variety of messages that appeal to different value systems. But this is really important. Please be authentic. People can smell pandering from a mile away, and you'll lose their trust if they think that if they're being manipulated, or you know, if they don't feel that you're being authentic, it just won't work. If you still have lead tackle, a lot of us still have lead tackle in our boxes from many years ago. I still have some of my grandfather's tackle. There are places that you can deposit it, and there are places that you can buy lead-free. If you visit fishleadfree.org/ME, there's information about where you can buy lead-free tackle and where you can deposit your tackle. It needs to be done safely because it's toxic. And Maine Audubon also has a promotion right now where they have a coupon that you can bring in to their participating retailers. You can see it at the bottom of their poster here, where if you bring in your lead tackle, they will give you a coupon toward lead-free tackle. So that's something that you can do as well. I'm going to give a special thanks to my academic committee. Lots and lots of people who helped with this project. I thank you so very much. I thank all of you for listening to me and for being here today. And I'm happy to take any questions. And before I do, though, I'm going to say hi to my mom. I love you.
That's great. I love having mothers on our calls. There was one last week, too. That was awesome. Thank you for so much great information. We do have a few questions coming in. If anybody has anything else to ask, just type it in the Q&A box. I'll see it and I will pass it along to Brooke. One question that's come up from a couple of people, Brooke, is about why boat loon strikes have gone up in recent years, and also associated with that is that, do you think it has anything to do with faster, more powerful, speeding motorboats?
That's a great question. I think there's a few things, and Susan, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this too. The first thing I would say is that, as I've talked to Mark Pokris about this, we didn't, or his team, I guess, they weren't recognizing boat strikes early on. So it really wasn't a thing, if you will, until as the study progressed and they started recognizing this, and then it was listed as a boat strike case. So part of it is the methodology changed a little bit. Another part of it could be that there are more loons. We know from the loon counts that populations have increased. And then we also know that there are more people using lakes. So it's more loons, more lakes, different methods. I think that's why we're starting to track it a little bit better. I don't know any data about speeds of boats or an increase of boat use. I know just anecdotally from some of our survey takers and people that I talk to who live on lakes, that they seem to be more concerned about it than they had in the past. I don't know how other people feel about this, but it's really an interesting thing, and I think it's something that we should be studying a little bit more.
Yeah, related question. Someone asked about how can you avoid boat strikes and loons, and really I'll jump in and answer that and you can add. But I think really the key is just being aware of your surroundings. If you're on a lake where you know there are loons, keep binoculars out, just be aware of where they are. They can dive and come up unexpectedly for sure. But all you can do is really be aware of where they are and keep an eye out for them as you're out in your lake.
Yeah, I think people forget that sometimes the loons go out into the middle of the lake, in the deepest part of the lake, to fish. They sometimes think of them as nesting near the shore and staying near shore, but they go out in the deepest, most central part of the lakes a lot. So yes, just being aware of your surroundings, not just for loons, but other wild birds as well. But unlike a mallard, for example, that can just kind of burst out of the way, a loon can't do that. They are very heavy and they can't just burst and fly off. So they always dive away. And unfortunately, a lot of the injuries that we see are pelvic and lower back injuries as they're trying to dive away from the boat. So shattered pelvises and things like that. So yeah, I think it's something, it's something that I hope people pay more attention to.
Yeah, let's see. There's a lot of great questions, and just I'll add that what we've done in the last 2 webinars is we've put together the questions that we didn't get to, because we want to try to wrap this up on time in about 5 minutes. But so if you have a question, be sure you put it in the, I see a lot in the comment box. If you could just copy that and paste it over to the Q&A. We have a record of the Q&A that we'll print out, and we'll get a file with all the questions. What the chat doesn't save in our file. So move your questions over to the Q&A. We'll definitely follow up with everybody after this, but we'll do a couple more questions before we run out of time.
Okay.
One question was about the response rate for your survey, and the 13% response rate. And a question was, would it be skewed to people who care more about loons? Would people who care more about loons would have answered your survey? That's
a very good question, and it is something that we're very considerate of when we design the surveys, and not just design the survey, but design the survey invitation. We didn't want it to be a loon survey, because then you would get mostly people who already care about loons. So we tried to word it so that it was we had some invitations that were more skewed toward the loon side and some invitations that were more skewed toward anglers. So if you're an angler, please take this survey. But yes, it's a consideration that you have to make. So yes, we did think of that. The survey response rate, for the methodology we used, it was actually not bad. It was cold mails, so mailed invitations in snail mail, and people didn't expect them. A way to increase survey response rate would be to have an intercept survey or something in the middle, so that people can expect there's a big long survey coming in the mail. So kind of getting a notice, and that would have helped increase response rate, I believe. But unfortunately, just we weren't able to do that. We were running on pretty limited supplies. But for the methodology we used, which was the mail invitation followed by an email survey or an online survey, that's pretty consistent with the methodology we used. And you can test for response bias in your survey, and by comparing your population that took the survey right away versus the population that took it kind of as time went on. We sent out some reminders trying to get more people involved, and you can compare those 2 populations to see if there's response bias. So yes, great question.
All right, I'll ask one more. We're running out of, or a little bit over time. I'll ask one more question, but I will address one really quickly, that if anything you want to know about lead sinkers, that website Brooke mentioned, fishleadfree.org, has all the state rules. Some people have asked about state regulations. Those are listed on that website. There's great pages on alternatives. There's tons of alternatives to lead sinkers. They've really, the alternatives have really exploded in the last few years. So that's a great resource. And again, apologies for all the questions we didn't get to, but look for a follow-up email. I'll just wrap up with one question, which is one of our earliest questions we had, which is about necropsies. There's been a change in the number of necropsies performed each year, so we don't have a regular sample. How does that affect your data or your results? Because some years people are turning in more, or they're getting the word. how do you think that influences your data?
Yep, so we try to look for percentage of lead based on what we bring in. So it's not just number of birds that have lead poisoning, it's the percentage of birds that we have brought in and necropsied as a whole. So if we have 100 birds that year, it's the normal average is around 30 or 35 birds a year, adults. And so it's percentage of those birds that we've necropsied, how high the lead is. It's not just numbers. But yeah, this is not a standardized study. It's very opportunistic. We collect carcasses whenever we can, whenever it's convenient for people. And so some years, we noticed after the Fish Lead Free campaign started, the number of reported loons went up. People were just more aware of it. And then some years it just went down. So yes, it's something that we have to consider. It's not a standardized study, and there is variation, but we just look at percentages.
Great. Let's see if you could stop I'll just put up our last wrap-up slide, which is from my screen. Thank you guys all thank everyone for attending. Again, it was really great to have so many people on and interested in this topic. We will, hold on, let me see if I can I'm gonna have the same problem you had, which is I can't switch between my slides. I did have a wrap-up slide, which for some reason I cannot get to, but oh, there we go.
Oh, there it is.
So again, I hope many of you can come back next week for optical brighteners. You'll learn a lot from Ben Pearls. If you like what you heard today and you want to know more about us or become a member, we'd love to have you. We are a membership organization. You can visit us on our website, which is on the screen. We'll send out a recording of the webinar. You can share that with anybody you would like to. Again, we'll follow up with the Q&A that we didn't get to. There were some really great questions, so we will get to that. After this, when you guys log out of the webinar, there'll be a quick survey. It's short, just 5 questions. We would love it if you'd fill it out. It's really helpful for us engaging how these are going. And there's a specific question about loons, lakes, and where you're from. So please go ahead and do that. Thank you so much, Brooke, for giving this great presentation. Thanks to everyone for joining us, and hopefully we will see more of you next week.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.